Hello, First Presbyterian. Welcome to our last session on our Lenten series. So we're in this book right here, Entering the Passion of Jesus by Amy Jo Levine, and we're looking at the 6th chapter in that book. If you're reading it, that's great, and if you're not, that's okay too. You can still, hopefully this video series will still be beneficial to you. So in chapter 6, we're looking at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. So that's the passages we're looking at today. And in the book, she focuses particularly on Mark chapter 14, verses 32 through 52, and John 18, 1 through 11. You can, of course, look up the story in the other Gospels as well, but that's where she's focusing her work. And so if you haven't read those passages, you might want to just pause the video right now and look those up and take a minute to read through them. Mark 14, 32 through 52, and John 18, verses 1 through 11. So we've finally come to the Garden of Gethsemane. And of course, lots of important things happen here, but I just want to talk about a few of them. And I want to start with the idea of Jesus praying and the idea that Jesus prays for himself. And I think this is worth thinking about. What does it mean that Jesus prays for himself? I think Jesus praying for himself shows us several important things here. There's some important ideas here. First, that we can go to God in any and all circumstances. Jesus is distressed, he's discouraged, he's afraid. He goes to God with all of that in prayer. Second thing we can learn from that whatever distress or fear we're feeling, whether it's now in the midst of the pandemic and of course all the uncertainty that brings, or any other time in our lives with the things that come and go in and out of our lives. Whatever we're feeling, Jesus has felt the same thing. Jesus knows what it feels like to feel distress, to feel agony, to feel fear, to feel sorrow. Hebrews tells us that we have a high priest who can sympathize with us in all things. And so whatever we're feeling, Jesus has felt that too, and he understands that. And we see that very clearly in the Garden of Gethsemane passage. Third, I think Jesus in this passage really invites us and gives us permission to pray for ourselves. And maybe that's something you do all the time, and maybe it's not. Maybe sometimes we feel like we should be praying for others. Our prayers should be outwardly directed, and of course we should be praying for others. But Jesus here prays for himself, and I think that's a really important idea, that we can pray for ourselves, that God has given us permission to pray for ourselves, to ask God for help, and then to trust him to be our help and to give us help. And I know that that's a lot easier said than done. So I hope no one thinks that I just think that's easy. I don't. I struggle with that myself, and I don't always know what it means to pray and trust God. But Jesus is our example, and so we can look to him to see what that looks like. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, that's a really great place to look. So I'd encourage you now to just pause the video. And if you're by yourself, to maybe reflect in your journal or write some things down. If you're with someone else, maybe you can talk about this or just write some things down on your own, whatever is best for you. But just pause the video and write down a few things you want to pray about for yourself, that you want to ask God for help with, or anything else. Using Jesus as your model, just think for a few minutes. What do you want to ask God for yourself? What do you want to pray to God for yourself? And if you'd like to, just while the video is paused, take a moment and pray to God and ask him for the things for yourself that you've written down or thought about. Okay, so Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. The next thing I want to talk about is the idea that I find really interesting, that Jesus is in a garden. And he, one of the passages says that he's at the Mount of Olives. And I think Gethsemane means something like olive press or something like that. So he clearly is in a place where olive trees and olives are growing, but it's a garden-like scene. And of course, this should call to mind for us Genesis chapters 1 and 2, because those chapters at the very beginning of the Bible are set in a garden. God begins his relationship with humanity in a garden. That's where everything starts between humanity and God, between us and God. And of course, that garden is called the Garden of Eden. And I have a personal love for the name Eden. My daughter is named Eden. And the word Eden means delight. And so God begins his relationship with humanity in the Garden of Delight. And I think we're we should get the idea that God delights in us, in humanity, and humanity is supposed to delight in God. And when humanity does that, then everything is delightful. The garden becomes the scene in which God and humanity are perfectly related to each other. And God perfectly loves humanity, as he always does. And it's a time when humanity loves and trusts God perfectly, which unfortunately doesn't last, as we know. And so the Garden of Eden is a delightful place when humanity delights in God by loving him and by trusting him. And yet the garden, of course, is also the place where Adam and Eve faced their own temptation. And that's the place where they faltered and where they decided not to trust God, where they decided that maybe God didn't have their best interests in mind, and maybe God hadn't told them quite everything, and maybe there was something more that they could get for themselves if they did their own thing instead of obeying God and trusting him. And so when they made that decision, of course, the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Delight, came to an end. That was it. And so it's in a garden where God initiated his relationship with humanity, but it was in that same garden that humanity fell into sin and death. And so here we are again in another garden, the Garden of Gethsemane. And there's Jesus facing a very similar temptation to Adam and Eve, pretty much the exact same temptation. The temptation to either trust himself and to do things his own way, or to trust God and let things unfold in the way that God wants them to unfold. And this is always ultimately a question of trust. Did Adam and Eve trust themselves, or did they trust God? Does Jesus trust himself, or does he trust God? And of course, the way we know is how they act, how they behave. Adam and Eve trusted themselves. They decided to do what they thought was best for themselves. Jesus, as we know, decides to trust God. Jesus doesn't want to go to the cross. He makes that pretty clear. And yet he says, not my will be done, but thine. Jesus fully trusts in God, even though God's plan, quite frankly, doesn't seem like the best plan to him at the moment. And of course, if there's anyone who has a right to think he can go his own way and he knows best, it's Jesus, who is, of course, himself God, the Son of God. And so if there's anyone who has a right to say, you know what, I disagree, I'm gonna do my own thing here and I think it'll be fine, we would expect that from Jesus. And yet Jesus doesn't do that. And so it's in this moment, as in every moment, but in this moment we see very truly and very completely that Jesus is the true human. This is what it looks like to be a real, true, full human, to trust God and obey God no matter what. When Adam and Eve decide to trust themselves, they become less human. They fall from the position that God wants for them. They become less than what God wanted them to be. They become slaves to sin and death. Jesus, by his willingness to trust God, to put his whole life into God's hands, shows us what it looks like to be a true human. Jesus's human nature perfectly trusts in and obeys his divine nature. And so he is, in fact, the true, complete human. He succeeded where Adam and Eve failed. Adam and Eve dragged humanity down into distrust, sin, and death. Jesus lifts humanity up into trust, righteousness, and life. He trusts God with his whole life. And of course, we see that this does in fact lead to the cross, but that's not God's ultimate answer to Jesus. God's ultimate answer to Jesus, when Jesus says, I trust you, and remember, Jesus' last words on the cross are, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. The last thing Jesus says is, I trust you. And God's answer to that is resurrection. So God proves himself trustworthy to Jesus. So let me ask you, now might again be another good time to just pause the video for a few minutes and to reflect on some ways that you want to practice trusting God right now in this time in your life. And of course, all of us, in some ways, this is a really unique moment in history. I was just thinking about it. And as I'm talking to you and as I talk to my students at USF, because, I say this moment in your life. And so often when I say that to my students, I recognize everybody's got something different going on. Each person has their own issues. And I don't always know what those are. Often I don't know what those are. And of course, that's still true. At the same time, there's one kind of overarching issue that's true for all of us, and that's the pandemic. And all of us are struggling with that, but in different ways and with different problems and with different issues. But that's something confronting all of us right now. And so pause the video and just take a few minutes to think about, what does it mean for you to trust God right now? And you can reflect on that by writing about it or talking about it with the person next to you. But what are ways that you can trust God right now? What are things you can do to embody that trust? Because trust means that we're saying God is trustworthy, and so I act as if God is trustworthy. So what can you do, little or big, to kind of embody your willingness to trust God right now? And then the last thing I want to point out from our stories about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is how in the two passages we're looking at, Mark and John, Jesus is actually portrayed in kind of really different ways. In Mark, he's portrayed as being genuine, really in distress and agony. We see him, just genuinely discouraged and distressed. And I think that this picture of Jesus can be of great comfort to us, because we can find ourselves in distress and agony. And it can be a great comfort to know that Jesus knows what that feels like. And we're not the only ones to feel this. And I don't just mean other humans have felt it. Jesus himself has felt it. It's good to know that Jesus has been through what we've been through. But in the Gospel of John, Jesus is portrayed as being absolutely and totally in control. He's very calm, he's very firm, and he's very much in control of the situation. When the people come to the garden to arrest him, they say, are you Jesus of Nazareth? And he says, I am. And this happens 3 times, because when he says it, they fall back or fall down. It's almost like they're compelled to worship him, even though they're there to arrest him. And finally, Jesus says, look, I'm the one you want. Take me and let these go. Meaning, let the disciples go arrest me. In other words, in John's gospel, Jesus is essentially organizing his own arrest. He's telling everybody what to do, and he's making sure that they do it. Jesus is firmly in control in the Gospel of John. And this also can be a great comfort because, of course, it's a great comfort to know that Jesus is in control, that nothing surprises him, and that he is able to command any situation. Nothing is too difficult for him. And it's not that Mark's version is true and John's isn't, or vice versa. Of course, Jesus is a deeply complex and powerful person, and both are true. Mark is giving us a glimpse of Jesus in his agony and distress, and John is giving us a picture of Jesus in his power and in his command and in his control. Both Gospels tell us something really true and important about Jesus. And I think I'd like everybody to pause the video right now and just think about which of these pictures is most comforting to you right now. And that could easily change. Tomorrow you might find a different one comforting, but right now, which one is most comforting to you and why? Why is that picture of Jesus a comfort to you right now in this very moment? And then the very last thing I want to point out before we end is that in the John passage, when the arresting officers come and they say, "Are you Jesus?" Your translation might say that Jesus responds, "I am he," but in the Greek, he actually just says, "I am," and it's that name that God gives to Moses in Exodus 3 at the burning bush. And so, to finish off here, I'd like you to just take a minute and read Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 through 10. So pause the video and just read that, Exodus 3, verses 7 through 10. Now that you've read it, notice the verbs that God applies to himself in Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 through 10. He has seen the misery of his people. He has heard them crying out. He is concerned about their suffering. He has come down to rescue them. He is sending someone to bring them out of Egypt. This is the God whose name is I am. He sees his people's misery. He hears their cries. He is concerned about their suffering, and he comes down to rescue them. So when the arresting officers say, "Are you Jesus?" and Jesus says, "I am," he wants to remind us of the moment when God first reveals this name to his people through Moses. This is the God who sees, who hears, who is concerned, who comes down, and who sends a rescuer. Jesus is that God. And in that moment in the garden, when he says, I am, he is being all of those things. So think about how Jesus, in his passion, from start to finish, embodies all these characteristics of God. Jesus is the great I am who hears, sees, comes down, and rescues. That is what he is all about. So we've come to the end of our Sunday school class in a slightly unorthodox way. But I do pray for all of us in this time. I have to admit I was having a hard day today and finding all of this very sad and distressful. And I know many of you are feeling the same thing on different days, variety of days. But my husband, Nathan Hitchcock, who I know a lot of you know, wrote a song today, which I just loved and felt like it was perfect for not only Easter, but for this particular Easter. So I'm sending the link to your pastor, Nathan Esser, and hopefully he'll be able to share that with you. So I suggest that you listen to it now. At the end of our Lenten series, that you click on that link that Pastor Esser sent you and you listen to that song. And I hope you find a great encouragement in it, just as I did. Thank you all for letting me be a part of this. And I just pray God's blessing on each one of you, and that hopefully soon we'll be able to see each other in person.